go up to China, face is important, and so even when you go and do karaoke and you socialise, that's important too. So even if you don't drink, then it's important to make it very, very clear. But that doesn't mean you don't have to socialise. Okay, but you've got to make it very, very clear, because if you say you don't, and then halfway through the night you say, oh, okay, I'll try one, they'll be all on top of you. And you're not really being honest. So it's a matter of, I think the face comes from being committed to what you are promising with the supplier, and being seen to be committed again, 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 again. And then over time, then you'll find that relationship gets stronger. And that comes with visits. Visits, yeah. But if you ask a question about, are you measuring Chinese trust? I don't think I'm measuring that. Okay. Doesn't matter. I don't think it matters for what I want to learn from the study. Okay. But it does matter on the ground.
Yes. You focus on the, say, processes in the factory and the opportunities, that are there to help with documentation. Is there a central accreditation system like an ISO, or is there?
Yes, because in the electronics industry, all of these requirements are very, very clear. The ISO 9000 standards, and now they're talking much more about the environmental standards, and also the RoHS, the restrictions on hazardous substances, and that's something I didn't show you, but a lot of these, in the electronics industry, a lot of these suppliers, they have to get, or the customers require them to get lab tests done, not just on the final product, but on every component. A sample of every component has to be tested for, has it got excessive levels of palladium, mercury, and cadmium, and all. There's about 5 hazardous substances that are really under the RoHS standards. So yes, they are. And the customers enforce that on them. So do customers have different enforcements? Yes. Like I said, European customers are much bigger on the pollutants, the environmental aspects, and RoHS requirements. US customers are much bigger on the human rights, underage labour.
How reliable are the audit processes? And I asked this on the basis that I was talking to some people in the US, and one lady was involved with an audit firm because you saw about human rights, and this lady worked for an audit firm who would go into Chinese-based manufacturing, and they would interview workers on their working conditions and everything, so that the US supplier, the US purchaser of Chinese products, could say, well, see, look, our factory standards in China are really good and everything like this. And so they would go in there and do the audit, yes, basically to give credibility to these reports, right?
Yes.
But what was happening was there was at least one other company from the US who was being employed by the Chinese suppliers to train their workers how to perform in an audit interview. And so you have one firm going in there training them how to perform the interview, and then another coming in there and doing the interviews. So how credible is the audit process? Yeah.
So you're talking about the environmental audit?
Now this is the HR audits for US based, because and you're right, what in the US, and I think a lot of this is because of Nike with the sweatshops.
Yes.
And so because of that, companies in America want to be able to say to their customers, yes, we do get this stuff made in China, but hey, we do adhere to minimum standards of HR and all this sort of stuff, right?
Yes.
And so, in one way to give credibility to that is to go and say, look, we've even sent auditors over there to audit the factories and interview the workers, and look, here's the report.
Right.
And we are meeting the standards that we're telling you that we have over there.
Yes.
Right? So it's like a verification of their claim.
Right.
But she was telling me that with some of the places they'd gone to, the workers had actually been trained by trainers before they got there
Yes.
to how to jump through the hoops in the audit interview.
Yes.
So that, for example, she was telling me that one of the things they were told never to admit to in an interview was that they worked a 7-day week,
Yes.
or that they never worked any more than 10 hours on any one particular day.
Yes.
And so they were basically said, these are the things you can't do. So they were prepping them for the audit interview.
Yes.
So then my question is, when we have audit processes, how reliable are they when we're talking about Chinese-based?
They're more reliable than they were 5 years ago. So I think it's a learning process.
Yeah.
And not all audits are perfect.
Yeah.
And there's always a game being played.
Yeah.
Right? But in the process of forcing the supplier to play that game, they are learning.
Yeah.
And so the major electronics companies are putting more pressure on their Chinese suppliers to be more stringent on. Like here's an example of an audit here. This is a factory audit, not a product audit. And so when you look at it, it's very, very detailed. They talk about it. Here's the factory, and they take photos of everything, what it looks like, the working conditions, the production line, what the workers have to do, the organisation chart. So you've got to get the audits done by a credible auditor.
Yeah.
And also they go into detail, okay, here's how efficient the production line is. So they do a look at productivity of the production line. And then they even go further to look at, okay, so what about safety of the machines, the assembly line, what about the warehouse condition, what about the power supply, okay, outage in the area. They ask several people, workers and management. Maybe sometimes when they ask, they can't verify. You're right, but I think it's a starting point in terms of learning. They've got to take photocopies of all the licenses. Also, they've got to inspect the track record by the client. How many QC staff are in the whole factory? So this is part of a QC audit. But also then they've got to take photos of, so for example, compliance with the labour laws, working hours, 8 hours a day, and then they will look at the timesheets of all the workers, and they'll also they'll take photos of the living conditions of the workers, and so they interview the workers. Is there fire extinguishers? So this is health and occupational safety here. So that's a fire hose here. That's a fire hose. Okay, and fire extinguishers, safety conditions. So the canteen. So not just the factory. What are the conditions about where the workers are working? So actually, we've got to take photos of how fast is it, how close is it to the nearest hospital? Okay, is there a first aid kit? No first aid kit in the workshop, only a small quantity of drugs was kept in the office. Okay, first aid training, no. Fire evacuation drills, no. So it's really, I think some of the audits are much more comprehensive now. And so do the workers have gloves or earplugs? Okay, and fire hose and extinguishers. And ROHS, you asked about quality, and so they have that certificate. So you're getting back onto the hazardous substances here. And so there's another audit I got which is focused much more on the social, and actually they take photos of all the workers' wage, hours worked and everything. So some of these audits are getting much more extensive, and they're being pushed by the major customer. Ultimately, a good audit comes from how the extent to which the major customer is pushing on these. And the large electronics customers are pushing more on this. So to answer your question, it's not perfect, but it's improving, and it's a learning process for both sides. Yeah, it's a very good question.
I suppose it's better to do something than to do nothing at all.
Well, there's much more transparency once you start auditing. An audit really is the beginning of a learning process. You know the audit is coming, even if you're prepped. You can't fail to learn or to be more aware. And on a positive note, the Chinese workers have much more power now anyway, with the wage rates going up and the desperate need for factories probably across the whole value chain to actually minimise turnover, because it's so hard to get the factory workers now. There's many more factories than there were 5 or 10 years ago. Yes.
There's a perception, I think it's more than perception, some of the early stuff that came from China was pretty crappy, you know, with spanners and stuff.
Yes.
Only use it once and it was broken.
Yes.
So obviously quality's increasing or improving. Over time, do you see that they're going to be short-lived, like Japan came in with quite good quality and
Yes.
then priced itself out, and manufacturing sort of hinted that some of the manufacturing's already leaving China?
Yeah. I think there's 2 parts to that question. Like your first question is, yeah, we saw Chinese products and you get them and 1, 2 or 3 out of 10 wouldn't work. Yes, you can go into shops in Mildura and buy things from the $10 shop and that still happens. Okay, but then at the other end of the spectrum, yes, you get some really high quality stuff coming out of China now. And a lot of the Japanese products are made in China now. They're designed in Japan and assembled in China.
The problem is, though, if you see something made in Germany,
Yes.
made in Germany,
Yes.
you've got this sort of feeling in the back of your head that is going to be last you for a lifetime. But you've got no confidence that if you see made in China, it's going to last at all.
Well, the iPhone's made in China. So there is, I think that's changing product by product and brand name by brand name. So in the consumer electronics, a decade or more ago, we always looked for made in Japan. Or I remember when you buy a new hard drive for your computer, you didn't want it to be assembled in Malaysia or Thailand. And now a lot of the assemblies in China, and you're thinking, okay, just get it anyway. So there's different, I think it's changing. I think it's changing. Now, I'll give you another short story.
Is it going to price them out of the market?
Pardon?
Is it going to price them out of the market?
Oh, you mean the Japanese and the Koreans?
Well, if the Chinese stuff is improving,
yes.
and you know, with all the audits and the additional cost that they're doing,
Yes.
how long are they going to be?
You're right. So an example with that factory that moved to Thailand. Okay. All right. When you go into Harvey Norman, a lot of what 90% of the stuff in Harvey Norman is going to be is Chinese, made in China. Okay. And in 10 years' time, yes, it will still be made in China. I don't think that will change. I think what happened for this company to move to Thailand was, in part, they had a lot of problems with the jurisdictional demands of different provincial governments from which they were sourcing components from. And there was a hint that they still had to pay some under-table money to get things done on time, get deliveries made on time. So that's still happening in China. It's not just the wage rates. And the other thing that irked them was their protection of IP. But the great thing about it, on the IP side, and I think they just had enough, so we're moving to Thailand. Okay, so we assemble in Thailand, we still source from China. We still source components from China, but we're assembling in Thailand so we can get our Thailand back to Europe much faster. Yeah. Okay, so that's what they felt worked for them. Their most important concern was the protection of IP. Okay, because they were making all these new designs and they just didn't want any copying. Okay, the Chinese IP laws are improving, and in the past, if you were buying from China, you get advice from a lawyer, and the lawyer would say, okay, especially a US customer, you get the lawyer to make the agreement, and maybe 30, 35 pages long, the jurisdiction for the settlement, any settlement under this agreement shall be finalised in Delaware or in a state in the US. But the problem is that when the Chinese supplier, if the Chinese supplier broke their side of the deal and you tried to take them to the law, take them to court, Well, you had to take them to court in the US. You couldn't take them to court in China because the legal agreement didn't have any substance because you made the jurisdiction USA. And so there was one case where this China agent that was working with this customer in the US, they had to wait for this Chinese owner who was copying the IP of their customer. They had to wait for the owner to actually fly to the US, and then they got the FBI agents all in and caught the owner in the US, and then they were able to prosecute him and everything. Okay? So, but now the recommendation is that you have an agreement with the supplier, you make jurisdiction in China, and the evidence, most recent evidence of court cases is that you can get a judgment against the Chinese, even if you're a foreigner, in China. So things are changing. I'm not a lawyer, but things are changing on that side. So that gives you more confidence that things are going in the right direction. And I think that that's a good thing. That will help change that perception too. Yes. But there's a lot of things going in many directions in China. It's like a horse race, and you just don't know which horse is in front sometimes.
Is there any reluctance on their part to participate, or it's all, or in the long run it's all just business and sales? Is there any sort of reluctance or resistance to these quality standards, etc., and so forth, or on their part?
Initially, they want to make something and they want to do the transaction. Okay, for the most part, like in the electronics industry, they are following the basic standards. Like they're learning from, they all want to go international anyway, because they see the markets for international to be the gold mine if you're a Chinese supplier. So they realise the value of these quality controls. But it really gets back to the customers too. Some electronics customers, or the big brand names, some of them don't just look at the ISO, they look at, okay, show us your, make that sample. We want to see you, we're sending engineers across next week to watch you make the sample that you promised to make for us. Whereas other overseas customers will just say, oh, show us a sample, oh, you've got your ISO 9000, okay. Okay, so in the end it's up to the customers to push how fast this is going. Okay, some of them are really pushing very hard. Okay, and not like Apple was really pushing it really hard in terms of getting the Chinese suppliers to go to the nth degree, not just good production, but good management systems in place. Now that's good for China too, because they learn by being pushed that way. They learn and then they get better.
As you mentioned earlier that wages had increased or almost doubled for them, as their other costs also increased, do you see a move for buyers to get things manufactured in other countries, as China, perhaps can't compete as well as newer
Yes. Yeah.
countries coming into it? Do you see that happening, or do you think it'll still be mainly in China for a long time to come?
I thought, and like talking to this Euro-Swiss company, before that I thought in some industries they would never leave China, like electronics. And now I think, wow, this is amazing. But maybe it's not an electronic product in itself, because it's more like a plastic design, like that travel adapter. But there is a transformer component in it, and USB, it's all in one. And so that really surprised me that they actually have moved their assembly operations to Thailand. But the component suppliers are still in China, and that probably won't change, okay, because they're all close together in a very close package. All right. In other industries, it's changing faster. For example, textiles, changing very fast. And so Cambodia, Bangladesh, Vietnam, all of them, the textiles industry is growing much faster. And also they're helped by the fact that I think when you're importing from China to Europe, exporting to Europe from China, textiles, there's greater duties in going into Europe than if you're importing from the Southeast Asian countries. So in some industries it's gone faster than others. Who knows what will happen? Anything is possible. It is so unpredictable to believe that the wages would sort of double in 3 years. Like the Chinese government only started having a minimum wage 7-8 years ago. But the minimum wages are much below what they are now. Like, you pay minimum wage, you cannot attract workers into your factory. And I remember a decade ago talking about 400 yuan a month for workers. Now, this Taiwanese factory with 500% turnover, they're paying 2,000 yuan a month, and they still have that turnover.
What's that equivalent in Australian dollars?
2,000 yuan divided by 7.6. So you're talking about 300 Australian dollars a month.
That they are working for?
Yes. And they're immigrants from in China, far west in China, so that's a big amount for them.
Yeah.
And on top of that, you've got health, and you've got travel costs, food, shelter provided as part of the whole package. Otherwise you can't attract them. So there's a lot changing.
Of your studies, how many of what you've done include state-owned enterprise? Is it?
That's a tricky question.
And is there different? Can you see clear differences in the between the private enterprise and the state-owned enterprise, and how in the survey and responses?
It's amazing. I think we did our first state-owned enterprise interview 2 weeks ago in Shenzhen. And so we go into the expo and you walk in, and the salesmen, like they're all salespersons, and they'll come out to you, oh, come and have a look at our booth, come and have a booth. And so you walk past the state and enterprise one, like this. But we ended up doing an interview with them. It's just, you can see the difference in the expo.
Yeah.
But we really focus on the private, not the state-owned. Like they're a different breed altogether.
Yeah.
And the China government really wants them to showcase some special industries, but in the international level.
Yeah, right.
So for example, in the finance, so in ICBC, the Bank of China, they want them to go international, those state-owned enterprises. But when it comes to electronics, it's really dominated more by the private. We're talking about component level. However, having said that, there are state-owned enterprises offshoots like Huawei and ZTE. So when you buy this little Dougal from, you all know what this is? It's a broadband Dougal if you want to roam on the internet, right? So where is it made? And you look at the back, it's, here we go, made in China by ZTE. So ZTE is a state-owned enterprise in China. So ZTE and Huawei, the China government is looking to them. Huawei is a state-owned enterprise that's has closer connections with the military in China. And ZTE is much more distant from the military. Anyway, so they're looking at Huawei and ZTE to be like the Nokia or the Apple or the Sony or the Sharp for China on the international stage. So if you ask me about state-owned enterprise, they would be two major. Look for them in the future. And you'll find Huawei and ZTE, I'm pretty sure they've got products out Harvey Norman.
ZTE definitely.
Yes.
Some places.
And you've got Haier. Haier is a big maker of white goods now. Yes.
Can I have one more question?
Yeah.
Where is the Chinese development in being out in the whole distribution network being more open and less compartmentalised? I don't know very much about it, but I understand if you drive 50 k's, you hit a border, and you can't even get across some of these, the county or state borders, the provinces within China. Where is that? Where are they in their development of opening that up and streamlining that? Because obviously you then talked about the containerised cost of goods, and that's obviously one reason it is so high, because you can't drive more than 100 k's without hitting something where you've got to pay or administrator or five-year plan.
I don't have time to go through all of it now, but
No.
I just want to show you.
Yeah.
Let me take this off.
It's certainly it's really important, I think, from our perspective locally as an exporter, a region that exports and wants to export agricultural, horticultural products. That how are we going to reach these second and third tier towns and provinces?
Well, the second and third tier inside China.
Yeah.
And so you'll notice that the very rich areas are right along the seaboard.
Yeah.
Okay, and Hong Kong's down here. You've got Shanghai, and you've got those related to Beijing further north here.
Yeah.
But there are different products in the different countries. So, for example, in the different provinces, and so the Yangtze Delta area is very big on the steel, textiles, home appliances, whereas the Pearl Delta, where I've done most of my interviews, is the high-tech electronics, lighting, machinery, textiles. Anyone wanting to assemble in China, any foreign investment in China, the China government's saying, okay, you really can't set up in here, you've got to go inside. Otherwise we're less likely to give you approval.
Entertain you.
Now, if you're trying to import to China,
Grapes, let's say grapes.
well, the markets where people will buy imported goods is going to be Shanghai, and it's going to be Guangzhou, it's going to be Hong Kong. Okay, you really cannot go in here.
For many other reasons.
Well, it's just too expensive, and the purchasing power is less. The shipping costs are higher. Everything. And so, like, really example of the shipping costs. Like, this is 1 hour, 100 kilometres from Hong Kong. You're right into Guangzhou. In that 100 kilometre area, you've got a majority of electronic component manufacturers. So if you're in the electronics industry, then great, this is cool, right? But if you're in another industry, not so good, right? So here's some of the shipping costs. So if you want to have a factory in Hefei, which is in a province, I was actually near Hefei 3 weeks ago, and we actually drove by car 300 kilometres from Hefei to Nanjing. It was pretty wild. Along that way, we passed a van. It had no accident, it's just upside down. I don't know what happened, it didn't run into anything, it's just upside down, and we just went past it. I don't know what's going on. But the roads are very good. But here's an example of some of the costs from UPS. 3,800 yuan to get from Hefei back to port in Shanghai. And then in the past, just 900 yuan to get from Kushan to Shanghai. Now it goes the other way. If you're distributing in China and you want to distribute inland, well then you've got to pay a lot of money to get it to Hefei. But if you're exporting to China, you want to focus on Shanghai and Hong Kong and Guangzhou. You really got to focus on the big cities. I don't think there's much point in going inland if you're selling food in China.
It was a naive question in some ways, but I was just interested to hear what you had to say.
I'm still learning too. Yes.
Well, thank you for that, Neale.
Yes.
And thank you for everyone for attending tonight. We have a little gift for you, because we always get a gift for our speaker.
Made in China?
Made in China. Hopefully made here.
I don't know, actually.
Quality made in China.
So, yes, and we also have a certificate as well. Which
Oh, excellent.
Drop in a couple of dollars.
so thank you, Neale. And we'll probably hear some more. Part 3 in maybe about 18 months' time.
Yeah,
That's what we're aiming for. And then we can sort of be like Star Wars and set up a whole synergy.
No, we do three episodes before.
Yeah, and then you have a gap and then you do another 3. All right.
Can I have my iPhone back, please?
Just as a side,
Yes.
they tell me that the big companies that are running containers into Australia are looking at doubling the cost of imported stuff because they just can't get containers to leave Australia?
Oh, I didn't know that side, but I know there's three types of containers, your 20, your 40 and your super maxi, and it really depends which area you're in, because and depends on your shipping agent and how fast you can clear the goods.
Well, the message that I'm getting is
But I didn't know that was
there's so
occurring.
much stuff coming in
Yes,
containers and
yes,
so little stuff going out.
right.
There's going to be a surcharge on